The waterways of North America offered a means of escape for freedom seekers heading north along the Underground Railroad.
African Americans built boats. African Americans sailed boats. And it's from that collective knowledge that they used these vessels to help runaways to freedom.
Off the coast of South Carolina, the search is on to locate a Confederate warship used in one of the boldest escapes in the history of the Underground Railroad. And new technology is making it possible.
The magnetometer detects variations in the magnetic field of the Earth, and we'll be able to assess where heavy metals are.
In Detroit, a secret network of abolitionist and indigenous tribes aligned to help freedom seekers make their final water crossing into Canada.
George the Baptiste guided slaves to his boat, the T. Whitney, where they take these midnight journeys across the river to Canada for freedom.
And in Canada, free black settlements emerged as places of hardship and hope, making the escape north worth the risk.
The thought of slavery also created the thought of freedom.
The history of American slavery isn't confined to southern plantations.
It's really a story that has yet to be told.
It lies beneath our feet, from the mid-Atlantic to the Midwest, into Mexico and Canada.
The Underground Railroad is really a story about people who made sacrifices to provide assistance to freedom seekers.
And now, cutting-edge technology reveals secret pathways and shelters.
It's very unusual to find evidence. Nobody wanted to write it down.
And sheds new light on courageous freedom seekers as they risk their lives in the ultimate pursuit of liberty.
I have been able to piece together stuff that most people don't know.
Since the first enslaved Africans were forced across the Atlantic Ocean in tall ships and brought to what is now the United States, black men and women have looked back to the water for their escape to freedom. On the East Coast, archaeologists are exploring several important water routes to uncover evidence of these life-or-death pursuits of freedom.
Some of them were inland waterways, some of them were actually ocean-bound or sea-bound.
For close to a decade, archaeologist Justin Donovan has been investigating African-American history as an underwater explorer and a co-founder of the Society of Black Archaeologists. Justin is also an active member of the organization, Diving with a Purpose, which explores and documents sunken crafts related to the Atlantic slave industry.
As a maritime archaeologist, I dive on a lot of wrecks, and usually the wrecks that we dive on, we don't know where they come from. We don't know their full history, their full story until weeks, sometimes months later.
One of the most famous wrecks of the Underground Railroad, the Confederate ship, the CSS Planter, is an important artifact in the remarkable story of Robert Smalls. While enslaved, he worked on the boat out of Charleston Harbor in South Carolina.
The important thing about the Planter, a lot of people don't normally associate it with the Underground Railroad. If we think about what was the Underground Railroad, it's the story of enslaved individuals obtaining their freedom. And there's no clearer picture of that than the story of Robert Smalls.
Born into slavery on April 5, 1839 in Beaufort, South Carolina, Robert Smalls and his family labored at the home of Henry McKee. As a nanny for his children, Smalls' mother had access to McKee and convinced him to send Robert to nearby Charleston at the age of 12, where he was hired out to work as a shipwrigger and later a sailor. It gave Robert valuable technical skills as he sent most of his earnings back to McKee.
People are very surprised by the intricate participation of blacks in the maritime industry historically.
Some of them worked on docks, loading and unloading ships. Some of them served on ships, helping and assisting with navigation. And some of them actually helped with the boilers on steamships and many other aspects of maritime life.
Knowledge of water navigation came over with many Africans enslaved and trafficked to America. Arriving in the port city of Charleston, South Carolina, enslaved men and women passed through its notorious private auction house known as the Old Slave Mart, which operated from 1859 to 1863.
This is the point of entry for hundreds of thousands that we can't even count. These cobblestones right here, this was the last time they looked down and actually saw freedom before they marched into that market to be sold and to be slaves in the United States.
Despite being faced with a brutal future, the people there still found inspiration.
The thought of slavery also created the thought of freedom, how to escape, how to get away. Because of all of that, this was also the idea where the Underground Railroad began.
As the years went on, Smalls gained more knowledge and his responsibilities increased. He eventually began working on the planter as a deckhand, where he studied every move of the captain to learn the intricacies of navigating the ship.
Robert Smalls ended up ultimately serving as almost second in command of what would be today the captain of a ship.
While still enslaved, Smalls grew to adulthood, married, and became wheelsman or boat pilot of the CSS Planter, a double-decker Confederate warship. The steamer maneuvered easily in the river waters, carrying transport equipment, arms, and messages between ports on the Charleston shore. The Planter was armed with two powerful cannons, one on the bow and one on the stern, and it was reportedly one of the fastest boats in the area. By 1862, Robert Smalls realized he could never earn enough money to buy freedom for himself, his wife Hannah, and their two children.
Robert Smalls had an idea of running away after many months and probably years of thinking about it, decided to make that idea and that dream come true.
We tend to diminish the capacity of the people escaping because, you know, it's all emotional and spontaneous and hurried. Sometimes it's plotted. It's really forethought. It's really been laid out.
While under the constant watch of the Confederate Army officers operating the Planter during the day, Robert Smalls made plans for a daring escape at night.
What happened was one night when the rest of the crew was on shore, he sent word out to his family and to some of the family of some of the other enslaved crew. And around 3 o'clock in the morning, he steamed up the boilers and actually left the port.
In the early morning of May 13th, 1862, Smalls set sail from the East Charleston Southern Commercial Wharf. He then secretly picked up his family and crew of friends close by, right under the noses of the Confederate Army in the midst of the Civil War. At the time of the escape, the Planter was carrying 4 cannons destined for nearby Fort Ripley, located in the middle of the harbor. Union forces had blockaded Confederate ports, including Charleston, to prevent goods and weapons from leaving or entering the South. Surrounded by a heavy military presence in a dangerously tense atmosphere, Smalls steered the Planter southeast through the Charleston harbor directly towards the Union ships.
It was the Civil War in the heat of the battle, and his plan was to actually head directly for that blockade. What he had to do first was to keep the Confederate flag up, as he was still in Confederate territory. And as he passed through with the Confederate flag, he gave the signal.
To disguise his face, Smalls put on the captain's straw hat and responded with the proper Confederate whistle codes, 2 long blows and a short one to pass. The most dangerous part of the journey was sailing past Fort Sumter, nearly 2 kilometers from Charleston. The heavily armed fort was built on a man-made island at the entrance to Charleston Harbor to protect the city from an invasion by sea. If the Confederates on patrol suspected that the Planter was being used by an enslaved person to escape, they would have fired on the ship immediately.
He was able to maneuver because he knew the way, because he had practiced it so long.
After sailing past the Confederates at Fort Sumter, the Planter slowly sailed closer to the Union blockade fleet. As Smalls approached, the Union forces prepared to attack the Confederate vessel, putting Smalls and his passengers in grave danger.
As soon as he was out of range of the guns from the Confederacy, he switched the flags, put up the white flag, and made his way towards the Union.
Putting up a white flag is a universal sign of surrender. Smalls didn't own one, so his wife Hannah brought a white bedsheet to use instead. With foggy conditions, the flag was not initially seen, so the Union forces came dangerously close to firing on them.
It was in the middle of the night. I know they were anxious. I know they were probably scared.
When he reached the blockade, the Union realized that this was actually an enslaved African with a number of other formerly enslaved individuals, and the Union accepted him.
Robert Smalls guided straight through some of the most dangerous borders to make it through the Charleston Harbor.
Robert Smalls, his family and friends were finally free. As he boarded the Union ship, the Onward, Smalls triumphantly told the ship's commander, "Good morning, sir. I brought you some of the old United States guns, sir."
The Union not only gained a number of liberated Africans to fight on their behalf, but they also gained the ship itself, the Planter.
The heroic escape made national headlines in 1862, with one magazine calling it one of the most daring and heroic adventures since the war commenced. After his escape, Smalls met with President Abraham Lincoln at the White House and ultimately was put in command of the Planter for the Union Navy fighting against the Confederates. After retiring from the Navy, Smalls entered politics and was elected to the U.S. Congress in 1874. He remained active in politics and public service until just 2 years before his death in 1915. With his legacy far from forgotten, in 2004, the United States Army named a ship after him, the USAV Major General Robert Smalls. As for the Planter, it was eventually wrecked in March 1876 while attempting to tow a schooner up the coast from Charleston. And now, underwater archaeologist Justin Donovan is determined to find it.
Terrestrial archaeologists and a maritime archaeologist were really dealing with two different types of methods in terms of how we do our work. But when we do terrestrial archaeology, we're normally digging down in layers, trying to uncover history as we go deeper and deeper. When we're dealing with maritime archaeology, we're usually dealing with more of like a plane crash. So the wreck is spread over a wide distance.
In 2014, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, tried to locate the final resting place of the Planter off the coast of Cape Romaine, South Carolina. After reviewing historic charts and hydrographic surveys, NOAA researchers used magnetic and acoustic remote sensing technology to find the Planter's general location. Some of the magnetic anomalies identified were consistent with debris from a ship's engine or hull. The area where they were located hasn't been revisited until now.
We have the magnetometer here in this case. Now, the magnetometer is essentially like a giant metal detector, very powerful.
So Justin is using the magnetometer to track down mass quantities of metal and confirm a more precise location of the Planter.
We've got the sensor on the front end here. This can detect ferrous metals, so your irons and your steels, upwards of 1,000 feet. So I'll be holding this underwater, and hopefully we'll get some good readings at the end of this and be able to detect where the Planter is. We believe the Planter is somewhere about 3 or 4 miles out. It's been buried for well over 150 years. The magnetometer detects variations in the magnetic field of the Earth, and we'll be able to assess where heavy metals are. All right, we just pulled up to the dive location, and we're kind of circling the point at the moment.
Yeah, that's a sonar image right there. And see those little bleeps right there? That's something sitting on the bottom. There's definitely something down there. See, there's something.
Yeah, anomalous.
Mm-hmm.
We're gonna dive down with the magnetometer, try to get a couple detection points, see if anything picks up, and hopefully we can see if we can pick up remnants of the Planter.
Right now, all researchers have to work with is a general location of the wreck. If Justin can pinpoint its location, future researchers can come back with more advanced equipment to study the Planter.
The magnetometer, as soon as you're in the water, I mean, you're holding on to the thing and it just starts taking you. So it's essentially like getting dragged.
The conditions north of Charleston off the Atlantic coast are notoriously difficult. Justin is dragged away from the dive boat by current speeds up to 3 meters per second as he battles 2.5-meter-high swells.
I'm kicking like hell. I wouldn't recommend it for the average diver.
Strong currents kick up sand dunes, making Justin's dive even more challenging.
The visibility, it's like a chicken soup down there. As soon as you start to descend down maybe about a foot, it goes from maybe 1 foot visibility down to you can't see the fingers in front of your face.
The massive steam engines on the planter were constructed using iron, so the magnetometer could be triggered by pieces of it.
Hit about 15-foot bottom, and to get a reading on the magnetometer, the interesting thing is there's not very much ferrous metal out here that would be detected otherwise. It was wild out there. It had to be at least 2 knots worth of current over there.
That's like having a 13-kilogram weight pulling you down in the water.
The 2 to 3 hits that we did get are the ones that would give us a clear reading that this is the remains of the ship. We definitely need to come back another day to do some more serious excavations. To dive on the planter at this moment is significant. I mean, this is a piece of African-American history, of American history, that most people don't have the opportunity to see. And knowing that our history lies not just on land, but also under the sea is powerful.
Finding the remains of the planter will further memorialize the daring escape that Robert Smalls achieved in 1862. But an even bigger maritime escape was attempted further up the coast years earlier, with shocking results. In 1848, 14 years before and over 800 kilometers away from Robert Smalls' daring escape in South Carolina, an abolitionist community made up of whites and free blacks were quietly working to help enslaved people escape the capital city, a major slave trading hub.
When people were considering escaping from the nation's capital, secrecy was paramount.
The secret plan to escape the city by boat would ultimately capture national attention and captivate historians.
A number of leaders in the black community had been able to collect 77 African-American men, women, and children to make the largest mass escape attempt by water in the history of the Underground Railroad.
The abolitionists who organized the escape included Paul Jennings, a black man formerly enslaved by President James Madison, and Daniel Drayton, the owner of a schooner called the Pearl. They gathered a group of enslaved people, among them a family of 6 siblings, sisters Mary and Emily Edmondson and their 4 brothers. The mission to escape on Drayton's schooner, the Pearl, sailing from a Washington, D.C. wharf along the Potomac River through the Chesapeake Bay. Their destination was the free northern state of New Jersey.
That next morning, when the slave owners in Georgetown and other places in the city wake up and they don't smell biscuits, bacon, they don't hear their enslaved people in the kitchen, they're wondering what's going on, and they launch a boat called the Salem.
Chesapeake Bay was pounding the Pearl with its typical harsh winds that can reach in upwards of 45 knots or 80 kilometers per hour. The friction between these intense cold winds and the warmer open water just outside the bay would have created choppy conditions that slowed the Pearl down.
No, the slave owners ain't playing that. You know, we need to stop this. We need to kill it in its birthplace because of what it represents.
Unlike the Pearl, the Salem was a motorized boat, so the white posse on board quickly found the Pearl near Point Lookout off the coast of Maryland. The escape attempt had failed a little over 100 kilometers from their starting point in Washington, D.C.
They bring them back to an absolute uproar at the city.
The incident gained national attention in 1848. Newspaper headlines echoed public anger over the attempted escape, sparking days of rioting by D.C.'s white residents angered at the idea of enslaved people seeking liberty on their own.
This was the nation's capital. There were people whose prestige went along with proving that black people were happy enslaved. They had no reason to leave. After all, they were treated so well.
All on board the Pearl were sold south, including sisters Emily and Mary, who were to be exploited as fancy girls, a phrase used at the time for sex slaves. Northern abolitionists were appalled at the national headlines proclaiming their fate. The Edmondson sisters were finally freed later in 1848 after their father, a free man named Paul Edmondson, and members of Brooklyn's historic Plymouth Church raised funds to buy their freedom before they became sex slaves. Emily and Mary Edmondson would go on to campaign with the anti-slavery movement, but little is known about the lives of their brothers or others after they were recaptured and sold south. Even when an escape failed, freedom seekers would learn from these incidents, with many continuing to use the Chesapeake Bay as a route to freedom. Bordering several states in the mid-Atlantic during the 1800s, the Chesapeake was secretly used by freedom seekers fleeing from Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia to reach the free states of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and ultimately Canada.
The Chesapeake Bay is a story that's intertwined with the African-American story.
Through the skills learned in the Bay while enslaved, many people of African descent became a vital part of the Underground Railroad's maritime routes.
African Americans built boats. African Americans sailed boats. African Americans powered boats. And it's from that collective knowledge that they used these vessels to help runaways to freedom.
While traveling this expanse, women and men would go to great lengths to avoid detection.
They would hide enslaved people under mounds of oyster shells on the deck of a sailing vessel. They would also hide them down in the front part of many of the sailing boats and the power boats.
More research is needed to enhance the understanding of these East Coast escapes. However, pollution and erosion in the bay is making this difficult. The Chesapeake Conservancy is using tools like high-resolution mapping and LiDAR, elevation data, to target areas most at risk and in need of preservation.
We're expanding the footprint, the foundation of Underground Railroad scholarship. We can now understand this historical era that wasn't available to us even 50 years ago.
The Bay has just as much relevance today in the lives of African Americans as it did since they were brought to this shore.
Sailing beyond the Chesapeake Bay and up the East Coast was not the end of the journey for freedom. Once they reached Ohio and Michigan, freedom seekers crossed more waterways, including Lake Michigan, Lake Erie, and the Detroit River, where freedom could be found 800 meters away in Canada, in the city of Windsor, Ontario. And it took a network of different communities working all over Detroit to get freedom seekers to the other side.
Detroit was a pivotal place.
Investigative reporter and local historian Ken Coleman has studied the role of Detroit's Underground Railroad, codenamed Station Midnight.
It had a network of abolitionists that worked at newspapers. Business owners were in on it. Churches, homes of worship, all created a network, a safe haven for slaves to ultimately gain freedom in Canada. Detroit was a very progressive place.
Despite progressive attitudes, Detroit wasn't a safe haven for freedom seekers on the run.
Michigan was a free state, but slaves still had to be smuggled and hidden and transported at night because there were people in Michigan, sometimes Detroiters, sometimes agents from the federal government coming from other states to look for slaves.
But in Detroit, there are those ready to meet the challenge. Churches and abolitionists use everything at their disposal to help hide freedom seekers under chase. Between bounty hunters patrolling the Detroit riverbank and the water itself, The final crossing into Canada was extremely dangerous for freedom seekers along the Great Lakes Underground Railroad route.
This is a really heavy shipping corridor, and especially was back in the 1830s to the 1860s. If you want to hop in a rowboat and go across the river, you don't want to get caught during a storm or when you have a lot of ships passing by.
So key abolitionists teamed with black freedom seekers to help them cross the river to Canada.
George the Baptiste, one of the most influential people along the Underground Railroad.
Black abolitionist and Underground Railroad conductor George D. Baptiste was born free in Fredericksburg, Virginia in 1815. Later, moving to Detroit in 1846 at the age of 31, D. Baptiste was a successful entrepreneur, the owner of a bakery business and a barbershop. Though never enslaved, he carried a deep burden for the treatment of men and women of his race and was motivated early on to help them escape bondage.
Baptiste comes here to Detroit as a business leader, and he buys the boat called the T. Whitney that gets people from Detroit to freedom.
The boat was used for commercial trade during the day and the Underground Railroad at night.
But he also worked with a network of people who helped him get people to freedom.
D. Baptiste received help from another important underground player in Detroit, the Second Baptist Church.
Second Baptist is the oldest place of worship for colored people in Michigan.
The preacher was involved. The congregation was involved. It was a total safe haven for men and women and children who were sometimes coming hundreds of miles away.
From the church, freedom seekers would secretly make their way to the waterfront to board ships like the T. Whitney that transported them under the cover of darkness.
It's been said that Baptiste would wait at the foot of the river and listen for rowboats of slaves who were ready to get on the T. Whitney and off to freedom.
Another congregation at Mariners Church is investigating its potential role in the network and the legend of a tunnel below it that people in the church have talked about for more than 50 years. In the 1800s, the original location of the church was a few blocks from the waterfront. But in the 1950s, the whole building was physically moved, and a crew member who helped with the move later reported having seen the tunnel.
We have a reputation as being a church that welcomes all people.
The church is actively trying to find conclusive proof through research and preliminary ground-penetrating radar.
Up top, what we have is basically a lot of concrete, and in that concrete is wire mesh. And it's such a tight pattern that it doesn't allow my radar to get through.
If there was a tunnel down there, we wouldn't be able to see it from this data.
Unfortunately, no. We might have to bring some technology in the future to really get a better sense of what we're seeing down there.
Whether or not there was a tunnel, I can only imagine that there was some type of activity that went on at Mariners Church in regards to the Underground Railroad.
The churches and abolitionists working to help freedom seekers cross the river into Canada were just one branch of Detroit's Underground Railroad. Just a few kilometers downstream, a lesser-known group of allies was also doing their part.
We're here along the Detroit River, and we can look across to Canada. This general vicinity was a major crossing point for freedom seekers in the early days of the Underground Railroad.
Historian and professor of African American history Roy Finkenbein has spent decades studying the known indigenous connection to the Underground Railroad in Detroit.
To understand the story of the Underground Railroad, one has to really acknowledge that much of the Midwest, including this place here, used to be Native American villages. Native Americans were major players in helping the Underground Railroad at this point and at other points throughout the Great Lakes region.
Roy's research has focused on two groups of indigenous people in particular, the Ottawa and the Ojibwe, who helped freedom seekers on their journey, starting as early as the 1790s.
Oftentimes, African-American runaways were welcomed into Native American villages because they could bring things. They could bring new seeds and foods, new technologies. One of the more beloved stories on both sides of the border is the story of Josiah Henson.
Born into slavery in Maryland on June 15, 1789, Josiah Henson escaped on the Underground Railroad with his wife and 4 children in 1830.
So he runs away with his family to southern Indiana with the help of a slave who rows them across the river.
After wandering through the wilderness, starving and exhausted, Josiah and his family encountered a group of indigenous people.
Both are very surprised by this, but the Native Americans welcomed them into their community, put them up in a wigwam for the night, feed them, and the rest is history.
Henson would go on to become one of Canada's most famous abolitionists, forming a community called the Dawn Settlement in Dresden, Ontario, which welcomed freedom seekers arriving in Canada.
Without Native American involvement, we may never have heard of Josiah Henson. We might not know his name. He would have just been an anonymous freedom seeker.
One of Canada's best-known and most beloved abolitionists, Josiah Henson, eventually settled in Dresden, Ontario, Canada. His family was laid to rest in this nearby cemetery, where new technology is being used to finally locate numerous other burials that have gone undocumented over the past 180 years.
He arrived on the shores of what was Upper Canada, now Ontario, in about 1830.
With the help of a local Indigenous tribe, Josiah, his wife, and their 4 kids, 2 of which were carried in a backpack, safely navigated Ohio before arriving in Canada. As a preacher, Henson would go on to welcome other freedom seekers at the Dawn Settlement, which he founded in 1841. It is now a cemetery and official historical site where Henson and others are buried, and work is in progress to preserve it.
This cemetery is known as the Henson Family Cemetery. As you can see from looking around the property here, it doesn't have a lot of cemetery markers. We only have about 22 that we know of.
Many grave markers have eroded, and it's feared that some newer burials are directly on top of the old ones. But Dina and her team have turned to ground-penetrating radar to help find the lost graves.
When we did the GPR work, it was actually jaw-dropping. The red, that is where there are deep burials. And as you can see, in some cases, it's very definitive. We have anywhere from 200 to close to 300 burials on this cemetery, which was extremely surprising because we didn't think there were that many descendants who had passed after Josiah in 1888.
While questions still remain about who is buried here, there is no doubt the site will continue to be a protected piece of history, like Josiah Henson himself. Though often overlooked, there was an important connection between freedom seekers escaping enslavement and indigenous tribes in the Great Lakes region, helping famous abolitionists like Josiah Henson make it safely to Canada.
We're just beginning to get a handle on the interaction that occurs on the Canadian side of the border involving freedom seekers and First Nations peoples.
DNA research has revealed a specific chromosome called RM173Y, which is common in people of sub-Saharan descent. It's being found in large numbers of indigenous people on both sides of the Canada-US border, where there are known interactions with freedom seekers.
Among the Ojibwe in central Ontario and among other groups, we're beginning to find evidence. Not only were freedom seekers welcomed in, but they were adopted, they intermarried, and today are what we might call Afro-Ojibwe or Afro-First Nations. The Underground Railroad story is incomplete without the story of Native Americans. And if we don't include it, it's not the real story.
Freedom seekers sought refuge in Canada before and after slavery was completely abolished there in 1834. Although the often treacherous journey through land and water had ended, starting a new life in Canada came at a cost.
Freedom seekers did find legal freedom in Canada. But Canada was not the land of milk and honey for many freedom seekers because they faced racism. There were segregated public facilities, segregated eating places like restaurants. In 1844 and in 1850, Ontario passed separate school acts, which basically relegated the children of Underground Railroad travelers to segregated schooling.
Despite the hardships, new Black Canadians settled and built communities all over southern Ontario, some of which still exist today, but many more have mostly been forgotten. Descendant Dr. Brian Wells in Puce, Ontario, just outside Windsor, has spent the last few decades sharing the legacy of his ancestors with visitors from all over North America.
My ancestors, John Freeman Walls and Jane King Walls, was a story that was stranger than fiction for its time.
John Freeman Walls, an enslaved carpenter, and Jane King Walls, a white woman, were an interracial couple who escaped from Rockingham, North Carolina, and traveled on the Underground Railroad through Indiana to reach Canada in 1846.
This is the original log cabin that John Freeman Walls and Jane King Walls built with their own hands upon reaching freedom.
The Walls purchased this land from the prominent abolitionist Henry Bibb, publisher of the newspaper The Voice of the Fugitive.
This became a terminal of the Underground Railroad, and even in the cemetery, there are enslaved buried there who came to Canada, were told to go look up John Freeman Walls and Jane King Walls. The importance of being able to live together as husband and wife in a free country, you know, allowed them to live a long time and allowed this story to be told by not only myself, but other of their descendants.
Southern Ontario was a sort of the main destination. You know, Windsor, Buxton, Chatham, Toronto, Kingston, Ontario, going up to Owen Sound, Collingwood, Goderich.
But many other black settlements in Ontario have been nearly forgotten. It is here, west of Canada's largest city, Toronto, that historian Irene Moore Davis is searching for the remains of a black settlement called Wilberforce.
It may not be easy to imagine when we look at this landscape today that it was once the site of a thriving community of African Americans who had made their way to Canada.
This rural farming community was established in 1829, named after the famous British abolitionist William Wilberforce, and settled by free blacks who had fled the growing violence against them in Cincinnati, Ohio.
These African Americans who had made their way here from Cincinnati set immediately to work trying to build new lives in freedom. They cleared the land, established farms, formed log cabins, and to bolster the economic life of the settlement, there was a mill down on the river.
Historical records point to the story of one of the town's most celebrated residents, Peter Butler III, born in 1859. Butler's grandparents were among the first settlers in Wilberforce. Peter Butler III started his policing career as a county officer, serving the greater community during the 1800s to become one of Canada's first black police officers. Peter's great-granddaughter Marlene Thornton is keeping his legacy alive, despite the secrecy surrounding him during her childhood.
My mother actually told me not to tell anyone about my background, that my grandfather was black. My mother had problems with that, and I just thought, I need to tell people about him, that they came here, they worked so hard to establish homes and family, and I'm proud of my family legacy.
Unfortunately, the Wilberforce colony fizzled out by the 1840s. It was simply a very difficult place to live. They found themselves more inclined to seek wage opportunities in cities and towns.
Today, nothing exists of the original settlement. LiDAR technology is revealing new details hidden in the rural landscape of the forgotten Black Canadian settlement of Wilberforce, Ontario.
We're going to be using a technology that's called LiDAR, so it just stands for light detection and ranging, to look at the topography, which will let us know about the landscape of the area, to reveal any sudden changes or maybe features or structures that might still be buried. This LiDAR system is going to fire up about 240,000 laser pulses a second, and we should be able to see in real time what the drone and the LiDAR system is actually witnessing.
Historian Irene Moore Davis is trying to uncover and document new information about Wilberforce, which is possibly still buried below ground.
The advantage of using this type of technology is we're able to cover large areas, which will allow us to create these beautiful 3D models at very high resolution.
The resulting data could reveal homes, farms, and businesses, or even an old mill that has been documented but no trace has ever been found.
The LiDAR system, it can detect very subtle changes in the landscape that the human eye can't really see. All these colorful dots that are popping up, that's our point cloud that the LiDAR is actually generating as it's flying.
What are these here?
Looks like the LiDAR is picking up buried or hidden structures underneath the ground there.
From this rural farmland, the LiDAR is providing digital evidence of the Wilberforce colony for the first time.
Could that be one of the buildings of the Wilberforce settlement?
Yes, it very well could be.
Gavin has located what looks to be a partial structure next to the river, potentially a remnant of the old mill, which could be invisible to the human eye.
From this data, we should be able to create a nice 3D model of this entire area.
Nobody's seen this before.
Establishing a digital record of this lost settlement area ensures the history of the brave people who came here will never be forgotten. Wilberforce isn't the only community to be nearly erased in Canada. An hour's drive east, the former settlement of Queen's Bush has also been reduced to remnants.
We know that there were more than 2,000 people that lived in the Queen's Bush settlement, and this is all that's left, a row of 15 headstones.
Tracy Kane is the descendant of Josephus Malott, who bought himself free and arrived in Queen's Bush with his wife and other families in the early 1840s. Tracy is trying to keep Malott's legacy alive for her two sons.
And here we are on the very land that my ancestor, Joseph Malott, cleared and farmed. Joseph Malott, he is my first ancestor that came to Canada. He came to Canada from Alabama. He was born in Alabama, born into slavery. From there, he actually purchased his freedom by working on a steamship as a cook. And from there, moved through Ohio and into Ontario, and into this land that I'm standing on right now. Our area that's here behind us stood and gathered many of the families from around the area. They would come here for one single purpose, to worship. But they came from everywhere, from every side, just to be here at this plot, just to worship. So they became a community up here known as the Queen's Bush settlement. There was actually a community that thrived, not just survived, but was thriving.
It puts a lot in perspective. You see a lot of these people on the gravestones, their young age.
A lot of hard working people, you know, they died at a young age so we can live longer.
Freedom seekers came into Canada with pride, and they had skill, and they applied both of those things to creating their own businesses and serving the Black community, but serving the broader community as well.
This is where your ancestors came to. Can you imagine walking into a forest much more dense than this, having trees that you had to clear so that you could farm without a tractor, without a horse? We know throughout Canada, the only way that Black settlements were even acknowledged is through the graveyards and the cemeteries. We need to start looking. We need to find them. Right here, this is the end of the Underground Railroad. Years of toil, years of sacrifice that produced freedom for my family, for all of us.
And across North America, from Canada to Mexico, the U.S. Midwest, Florida, and the Mid-Atlantic, technology continues to unearth new secret places, pathways, and more stories of brave men and women who are part of one of the most important freedom networks in history.